Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Grant. I'm the site manager here at our San Diego office, which is right there. So now you know where our office is. Thanks for coming. I want to thank Communion Church for hosting us. It's a lovely facility, and especially want to thank Chuck here who works for them. He, right over there, he helped us figure out all kinds of problems that are fixed, and so we're going to have a nice event. I'm going to open us up in prayer and do a little bit of an introduction, and then my colleague Jane at the end will close. But I did want to say first, so I don't forget, you see that little QR thingy, QRSTUV thingy? If you scan that with your phone, you can let us know you're here. That's our way of doing attendance. So if you don't mind, if you preferred the old way and you want to write a piece of paper, we can accommodate that. But if you don't mind, let us know you're here, and then we can be sending you follow-up, let you know more about us. So pretty cool. First time we've done that, but Jay knows all the cool technical stuff. Anyways, that's our sign up that you're here. Thank you for letting us know you're here. And again, I'm going to open a prayer, and then I'll introduce Matt and get out of the way. We are going to have a question and answer session, and really want to encourage you to take advantage of that. Matt's been doing this a long time, and particularly gifted to talk about all different things related to our topic. Let me go ahead and open us up in prayer, and then we'll get started. Almighty God in heaven, we do thank you for this day. We thank you for getting us all here safely. We thank you for the opportunity to come together and talk more about immigration and faith, and the scriptures, and modern situations to navigate in our nation and the world. We thank you that Matt could be with us, even having just been on border immersion, that he might be able to share with us as well right here in our own backyard in San Diego. We lift this time up to you, Almighty God, and ask that you would bless our time, and that you would give us a heart like David, which is to have a heart after you. And as we know from the scriptures many times over, you say you have a heart for the stranger, for the immigrant, and that you would call upon us to have that same heart, welcoming our new neighbors and helping them belong. We do thank you for the work of World Relief and ask your blessing on us to be faithful to you, and that you keep our hand to the plow. And as we seek to develop awareness here in San Diego with our relatively new office from SoCal, thank you for this opportunity to introduce ourselves and build relationships, especially with the church. As is in our mission, we partner with the church, and we know that's where the sustainability is. So we just pray that you would do things with this today, Lord, that you would bless our meeting and be with us. Pray your anointing and blessing over Matt as he presents to us and answers questions, that this time would please you and be edifying for us all and help us to serve you and one another better. We pray these things in Jesus' name, all your people saying, amen. Okay, so before we bring up Matt, I just want to share a couple quick things to introduce him. Again, he's our VP of Policy and Advocacy. And when I was first studying World Relief to apply for my job, I found a video by Matt on economics and immigration, common questions, and I was like, this is amazing. And I was already excited, but I was like, this is so fabulous. So I can't wait for you to hear him. When I gave my own presentation, sometimes I include that video, and people like that part the best of my presentation. In fact, when I was sharing some flyers at an event where I had given a presentation, when they saw his face, like, oh, we saw him in your presentation. I'm like, yeah, I could tell you like that part the best. So, but also, and it is great. We had a friend at another event in Orange County who came, said, I didn't have any expectations. He's a VP and professor at a Christian college in Southern California. He told us later he was blown away by the presentation. So I don't mean to put too much pressure on you, but I do want to thank you for coming, and I know you're going to be blessed. The other thing I want to highlight that really encourages me, every time I've seen Matt travel, and he travels all the time, he always has one of his children with him. Today it's Zoe in the back. Hi, Zoe. Thank you for coming. And I think if I recognize you have 4 kids, they're all starts with the letter Z. So I'm curious what's behind that, but I couldn't help wonder, because I have a big family of kids too. I wonder if it was sort of a subtle, because I don't know, they make you tired, but they're a great blessing, Psalm 127. But I have to find the story out. Maybe you can share us why all Z's, because you start with an M. But can we welcome up Matt to speak for us? Thank you. I'm going to let you speak to that. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Grant. I don't know that there's really a story behind Z's, except for we really like the name Zipporah, which is our firstborn. In fact, I'll mention her in a moment. And then we really like the name Zephaniah. And at that point, it felt like the other kids would feel left out if they got a different name, which was why we've stopped at 4, because should we have another girl, I'm like out of biblical Z names, except for Zilpah, but she was a concubine, and I don't know that anyone wants to be named after a concubine. So we're good with 4. But thank you, Grant, for that introduction. It's great to be here with you all. I love getting to visit our World Relief Southern California office, both here in San Diego and up in Orange County as well. Just as a little bit of an introduction to World Relief, we have been around for 80 plus years now. We started in response to a global refugee crisis in Europe in the days after World War II, when there was a church in Boston that wanted to do what they could to address this great crisis. So they raised funds and joined with other churches and with the National Association of Evangelicals, which was newly formed at that point, to launch what became the War Relief Commission of the National Association of Evangelicals. Fast forward a few years, it became not just war relief, but broadening their scope to world relief, to addressing any number of crises around our world. And that is still our mission. It's to boldly engage the world's greatest crises in partnership with the church. And for more than half of that 80-year history, we've been doing so in Southern California and in other parts of the United States by resettling refugees and welcoming other immigrants. Not here in San Diego for very much of that history, just up in Orange County, but we've been here in San Diego for a few years now as well. And because that is our mission, to not just engage a displacement and refugee migration crisis on behalf of the church, but in partnership with the church, it's of course very important to us that we know how the church thinks about these issues of immigration. And I didn't necessarily need to take a poll to know that it was controversial, especially in the United States in 2025. But we did take a poll because we really wanted to understand how are evangelical Christians in particular thinking about these issues. And I'm going to start with this finding from that poll. This is from Lifeway Research conducted earlier this year. We asked, what are the most important factors that inform how you think about immigration? And less than a quarter of evangelical Christians said the Bible. That wasn't actually shocking to me because we've done versions of this poll before, and it's a pretty consistent finding, but it is very troubling. Because as evangelical Christians who would say the Bible is our authority for everything, it should be kind of the obvious answer. But for at least 3/4 of evangelical Christians, they had some other response, whether that was a political perspective or my favorite cable news show or something on social media or personal experience or the experience of a friend or family. And all those could be actually very useful inputs into our thinking. But as Christians who look to God's word as our authority, we ought to start our conversation with the scriptures. So that's what I want to do with, I'll probably try to talk for 35 minutes or so today. And then I want to save a lot of time for questions because there's a lot happening and I don't even know what your questions are. So I'd rather save time and let you direct those to me. But we'll start with a little bit of the scriptures. I mentioned my daughter Zipporah. This was her several years ago. In the month of December, like many of you, we pull out our nativity set. And this particular December, Zippy was probably 3 years old. And she was, playing with the nativity set. She knows the story well from the storybook Bible that we'd read her even as a little baby, little kid. But she turned to me one day in our living room and said, "Dad, this nativity set is missing someone. We don't have the angry king figurine." And I thought about that. Do any of you have a King Herod figurine in your nativity set? Is maybe not our favorite part of that story. It's very pleasant to end the Christmas story with the Magi, the wise men, bowing down before Jesus with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And we can all go home and exchange some presents because even Jesus got presents. But that is not where the Gospel of Matthew ends that story. Because as soon as the Magi are on the way back to their country, Joseph is warned in a dream that Herod, this paranoid, tyrannical, angry king, is coming to kill all the little boys in Bethlehem. And he's told to get up in the middle of the night and escape across the border into Egypt, where he would be safe. And that's about the extent of the details we get in Matthew chapter 2 about that story. We don't know what the journey was like exactly. We don't know how they were treated, if they had any interactions at the border crossing. We don't know how well they adjusted once they got to Egypt. It's very possible there's people that welcomed them. It's also possible that there was people skeptical of them, who maybe said, "How do we know that you're fleeing from Herod and not spies sent by him?" Or, you know what, Joseph, we've got enough carpenters in this economy without you taking a job. That's only speculation. But what's not speculation is that Jesus pretty closely fits the definition of a refugee. Of course, they didn't have those formal legal definitions at the time, but we do have those formal legal definitions now. And I think the terminology is actually important because often these terms get used sort of interchangeably in sort of popular media in ways that are not always particularly precise. So under U.S. law and international law, a refugee is someone who has fled a well-founded fear of persecution, specifically on account of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or particular social group. And by that definition, the best estimates right now are globally, there's somewhere between 35 and 40 million refugees in our world. I mean, I've been at this work at World Relief and giving some version of this presentation for a pretty long time. When I started at World Relief, that number was about 12 million refugees. So these numbers have increased many times over just in the course of, I mean, I'm getting old, but I'm not that old. And what we see is this is a global crisis that is growing. And that's just those who are technically refugees. You have others who don't fit the technical definition of a refugee because no one has had the opportunity, no government has had the opportunity to verify their story. So those people are considered asylum seekers. Those are folks who show up in a country not having been invited to rebuild their lives because they were already found to have fled persecution, but they show up and they make the claim, I have a well-founded fear of persecution, for one of those same 5 reasons: race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. And at least under U.S. law, if you can prove that, which can be difficult to prove, you may or may not have the documentary evidence, but if you can prove it, you're supposed to be allowed to stay. And I say supposed to, we'll get to kind of current practice in a minute, but at least that's what the law seems to say. And if you can't prove that, you'd usually be removed. Another category we hear, and I've had people make the argument, well, Jesus wasn't a refugee because Egypt was actually part of the Roman Empire along, with Bethlehem, so actually Jesus was internally displaced. Well, that's fine. There's also 70 or so million people in our world today who are internally displaced, who have fled persecution or other conflict, but are still within the boundaries of their country. Actually, a lot of the work that we do at World Relief globally is in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Ukraine and Sudan and South Sudan, in Haiti, in complex situations where many people have been displaced internally, and then some of those people have determined it's not safe anywhere in the country and end up crossing a border and becoming a refugee or an asylum seeker. We could debate which of those categories best describes Jesus. But what's pretty clear is that Jesus was an immigrant. He moved from one country to another, at least for a time, and he was fleeing persecution. I don't know if his case would have persuaded a governmental official on account of, I heard it from an angel, but I believe it was a well-founded fear of persecution. And we certainly think at World Relief that ought to inform how we think about people in very similar circumstances today. Another really core biblical principle is at the very beginning of the scriptures in Genesis chapter 1, where we see that God creates both man and woman in his image. And Christians throughout history have understood this to mean that human life has inherent dignity. That if you are a human person, your life is valuable, is worth protecting, regardless of any qualifier, regardless of your ethnicity or your language, your religion, your gender, whether you're born or unborn, any of those factors, any other factor we could think of. If you're a human person, we believe that your life is valuable. And that would obviously give us an obvious motivation when someone is fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution to do whatever we reasonably could to protect that human life. I think that's actually, at least indirectly, at the root of why we have an asylum policy in the United States, this idea that human life is worth protecting. And if you go back in history, it was actually in recognition of a failure to protect human life when Jewish people were fleeing from the Holocaust, or from the early days of the rise of the Nazi regime, and came to the United States and didn't quite fit into the immigration policy categories that we had at the time, and were turned back. And subsequently, the United States and many other countries said, well, that was wrong because that life had value and we should protect human life. But there's another dynamic to being made in the image of God that I think is important for us to keep in mind, especially as we think about issues of immigration. And that is that if we believe that human beings are made in the image of a creator, it also means that human beings have potential to create and to contribute. And that's true for all people, including immigrants. But I think sometimes when we talk about immigration, we skip over that part because we very quickly want to go to, well, what is this going to cost us? How much are these people going to take? What are they going to consume? How many jobs will they take? Those are fair questions. And they're the sort of fair questions that a good economist can analyze, and actually all sorts of economists have analyzed those questions. But good economists don't do cost analyses. They do cost-benefit analyses, because they probably, whether they realize it or not, are influenced by that Christian idea that human beings are made in the image of God with potential to contribute. And so it's fair to ask, well, how many jobs will these immigrants take? But only if we're concurrently asking, how many jobs will they create? And the answer, at least historically, is very likely a whole bunch. Even if you just look at the biggest companies in this country, 45% of the Fortune 500 companies were founded or co-founded by an immigrant or their child. Tens of millions of jobs in this country wouldn't exist, or at least wouldn't exist here, if it wasn't for our country's legacy of immigration. Or you can also look at this on a fiscal level. So, well, what about the cost to taxpayers? Most of us are pretty well aware that our government is spending way more money than they take in. So can we afford to be spending money on people from other countries? It's a reasonable question. But the presumption there is often we spend money without sometimes asking, well, how much will those people contribute in taxes and in other ways? It is true if you look at refugees in particular. So again, this is a subset of immigrants who are identified by the US government overseas, brought by the United States government after being vetted to the United States legally and at the invitation of our government. And those immigrants actually qualify for some public assistance that most other categories of immigrants do not qualify for. They get some help for usually the first 90 days that they're in the country, cover some housing, and then they qualify for some public benefits based on their income levels. If you add up all those costs and the costs of vetting them overseas, you can come up with some significant numbers. It's true, actually, that for the first several years that they're in the country, let's say the first 5 years, the average refugee adult has received more from the American taxpayer at that point than they have paid in cumulatively in taxes. The same is true of my 5-year-old son, Zacchaeus. Total drain on the economy. He has not contributed a dime of taxes. Neither has Zoe for that point, even at 8. But actually, that's a little silly, right? We don't look at people at, small children and make presumptions about their lifetime economic potential based on what they've done in their first few years of life. And we should probably not do that with recently arrived refugees either. In fact, economists who've studied this find, and there's a good study out of the University of Notre Dame, finds that it's on average around year 8 that refugees go from receiving more than they're paying in to paying in more than they're receiving at a fiscal level. And that continues to be a positive trajectory, so that by 20 years after arrival, the average refugee adult has contributed $21,000 more in taxes at all levels, local, state, and federal, than the combined cost of governmental expenditures on their behalf over those whole 20 years. And actually, if you look at refugee children, their contributions are actually much greater because they tend to have educational attainment levels that are very similar, if not greater, than US citizens, and then end up having jobs that pay even more in taxes. You can zoom out and look not just at refugees, but at other immigrants, and the large consensus among economists is that there are costs associated with immigration, both fiscal and economic, but there also are contributions. And it's really hard to find an economist who thinks that the net effect of economic effect of immigration for the United States is not at least slightly positive. Now, there's also, I think, the question that a lot of people would have there is, okay, well, that's refugees who come here legally and immigrants in general, but what about someone who is not lawfully present? I think often there's this presumption, well, if you're not here lawfully, then you're not paying taxes, so you're not making those contributions. That turns out to be not quite right. It turns out that most economists also think that immigrants who are not here lawfully are also net economic contributors. In fact, the Wall Street Journal surveyed this economists on this question some years back, and they found that 96% of the economists they surveyed said that the net economic impact of illegal immigration for the United States was positive. There's a bunch of reasons for that. But one of them actually is around taxes. It's sort of, on its face, might make sense, well, if you're not here legally, then you're not paying taxes. But if you think a little more carefully, when you go check out at the grocery store, they don't actually ask you about your legal status. They just charge you sales tax. When you pay your rent, if you rent an apartment or you pay your mortgage, you're paying property taxes either directly or indirectly, regardless of your legal status. And in fact, most undocumented immigrants, or at least about half, are having payroll taxes taken from their paycheck. Income taxes, Social Security, Medicare. I say it's about half, that's the estimate of the Social Security Administration. Specifically looking at people their estimates of the number of unauthorized immigrants who are working, who are having payroll taxes taken from their paychecks. What that usually means is that you have people who are using a false Social Security number. Not a stolen Social Security number, because then it would show up as someone else, but an invented Social Security number. A number that doesn't actually match the name on the card. And they realize that, and they might send a letter to the employer, but they don't send the money back. They send it to my mother and to other people who've paid into Social Security in their years and have earned that. And the irony is you have people who are actually working without lawful authorization, paying taxes and subsidizing Social Security for the rest of us, because those people then cannot go apply for a retirement benefit, even if they work for 30 or 40 or 50 years with that invented Social Security number. When you add up the various contributions, the taxes that unauthorized, undocumented immigrants pay, it's about $8.5 billion in local and state taxes here in California alone. That's actually far more than any other state. But it's actually a pretty significant contribution. Now, to be really clear, at World Relief, we don't welcome immigrants primarily because we think it's in our economic interest to do so. We do so because we believe these are people made in the image of God, whose lives are worth protecting, whose dignity is worth affirming. But it is precisely because they're made in the image of God, with potential, that we shouldn't be surprised that they actually have a lot to contribute as well, both economically and otherwise. Another really important biblical principle is that God has this particular concern for those who are vulnerable. And in the Old Testament especially, we see at least three groups of people mentioned repeatedly in the same context. It's the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. Or depending upon your Bible translation into English, you might see that word as sojourner, stranger, alien, immigrant. It's the Hebrew word ger, and it appears in the Old Testament 92 times. So this is not one or two verses that we sort of missed somewhere. It's actually a fairly frequent theme. And even how you debate that, how you translate that word is a bit of a subject of debate among scholars. Tim Keller, before he passed away, made, I thought, a very compelling argument that really the best word in English for this Hebrew word is the word immigrant. The foreigner, which is what the New International Version translated it as, is maybe a little bit imprecise, because there are other Hebrew words for a foreigner who's a tourist passing through. But this is the idea of a resident foreigner, a resident alien who's coming to reside in the land. And our word in English for that is an immigrant. Now, there's a specific reason, actually there's multiple reasons, that God tells the people of Israel that they should care for the foreigners who reside among them. One of them is because he loves them. We see that in Deuteronomy chapter 10, where God loves these individuals, and then he explicitly tells him, therefore you shall love the foreigner as well. And another reason to love foreigners in particular is for the people of Israel, because they were themselves foreigners in the land of Egypt. That's a repeated refrain in the Pentateuch. And that's not an instruction for us, because most of us are not the people of Israel. But as Americans, most of whom are not completely indigenous Native Americans, we all have immigrant histories of our own as well. And probably very diverse stories under complex circumstances. We don't have time to go across the room and all to share how our first ancestors came to this country. But the lesson of the Old Testament is we ought to remember those stories. So that we can do to others not the way they did to our people, which may have been a generous welcome or may have been a lot of hostility, but so that we can treat people the way we would want to be treated. Not only do we see the specific this general command to love in the Old Testament, then God gives specific instructions to his people in form of laws designed to ensure that the needs of these vulnerable categories of people, orphans, widows, foreigners, would be met. So the best example I think of that is God tells his people, when you go through your crops, your olives, your wheat, your grapes, you can go through everything one time, but then you need to leave what remains for the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. Which I think was a really ingenious system. It wasn't a handout system. I think there was a recognition that there's a dignity to work, and so there's some work involved, but there was also this recognition that these particular categories of people were not likely to be landowners because of their status, and that meant that they were unlikely to be able to meet that most basic need for sustenance. And this was God's way to work through that. Now, we also see then later in the scriptures that God judges the people of Israel for failing to follow some of these rules and these commands to care for the vulnerable, the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. Another biblical principle that I think is really important is the command to practice hospitality. And this is one of those sort of good Bible words that I think sometimes we misunderstand in contemporary English. Because I tend to think about hospitality as like having a really fancy meal, like table settings and Martha Stewart recipes or something. Or maybe it's like, doing the laundry and the sheets and the towels so we have a really nice clean guest room when my in-laws come to stay. Those are good things to do, and I recommend them to you, but they're actually not hospitality if you're caring for your friends and your family. Because the Greek of the New Testament, the word that we see there is the word philoxenia. It is the love of strangers. And that could be a countercultural command in our society. I grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons. My favorite was DuckTales. I don't know if some of you are the right age to have appreciated this. I let my kids watch that recently, and I was a little startled by the opening theme song, which starts with, the danger, watch behind you, there's a stranger out to find you. This idea that strangers are scary people that we should be afraid of is pretty deep in our psyche. And I get why maybe we'd send that message to children, but I think sometimes even as adults we carry that with us, where we see people who are different from us, who are unknown to us, and our initial reaction is sort of a hunched up shoulders, here's a potential threat to me. Now, I'm not going to tell you that the Bible promises that all strangers are safe, but I can tell you in Romans 12 and elsewhere that we are commanded to practice hospitality, which is literally to practice loving strangers. In fact, I know we've got a number of pastors in the room. This is a requirement for leadership in the church in 1 Timothy and in Titus to be hospitable. It actually shows up right before being a good teacher. But in our society, we tend to think of being a good teacher as really important, and being a lover of strangers maybe doesn't make the job description. Now, the cool thing in the scriptures, in both the Old and the New Testament, I'm not going to go through all these examples, but we also see a lot of examples of people who were faithful to this command to welcome strangers and were blessed by God in the process. One of my favorite examples is actually Boaz in the book of Ruth. On one level, Boaz wasn't so exceptional. He was just following the rules in Deuteronomy 24 when he said, here's this foreigner and this widow who's come into my field. I'm supposed to let her glean in the field and watch out for her and make sure she's not mistreated. And he does that, but in doing so, he of course eventually falls in love with Ruth, and they get married, and they both become a part of the lineage of Jesus. I won't go through the other examples. You can go do your homework on that, but Abraham, of course, is another really obvious example. He sees these strangers off in the distance, and instead of saying, lock up the doors, there's strangers coming, he says, let's create a feast. And they end up being messengers from God with this news that God is going to bless him and bless the nations through him. And we see that alluded to in Hebrews 13, where we're told that some people, by welcoming strangers, have entertained angels without realizing it. Another very essential biblical command is the command to love our neighbors as ourselves. And we see this first in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. And then a few verses later it says, when foreigners reside with you in your land, you shall not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you shall be to you as your native born. You shall love them as yourselves. So even if we just had that one chapter of the Old Testament to work from, we could conclude that this command to love has broad ramifications, perhaps broader than we might have wanted to conclude. But Jesus makes this even more clear in the Gospels. In Luke chapter 10, he's asked, what's the greatest commandment? And he affirms it's to love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbors yourself. But the legal scholar who's sort of interrogating him and who wants to justify himself says, okay, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus responds not with a precise legal definition, but with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I won't rehearse that parable for you because most of you are quite familiar with it, but I think the obvious point of that parable, as we think about our contemporary moment, is that whoever the neighbor we're supposed to love is, it probably has to include a vulnerable stranger traveler of a different ethnicity or a different religion, because that's the example that Jesus gave us. I'm not saying that's an exclusive category. I think it includes a lot of other people as well, but that one's pretty clear. It's also worth noting that Jesus doesn't say, love your neighbor as yourself so long as it's completely safe. If you think about it, the Samaritan who cares for this beat-up guy on the side of the road, a road with kind of a bad reputation, is putting himself at some risk by stopping and getting off of his donkey and attending to this stranger. He doesn't know who the guy who beat him up was or where he is. He might be right around the corner. Might be part of why the priest and the Levite in that story walk on by on the other side and get out of there. Maybe they had an idea to call someone when they got to their destination. That's what I would probably do. But the hero of the story puts himself at some risk to care for this vulnerable stranger in need. And I think one takeaway of that is we are called to do the same. We're called to love our neighbors even if there's some risk involved. Now that would be true regardless, and even if I was about to tell you how risky it is to welcome refugees and immigrants here to San Diego. But it's actually not very risky to welcome refugees and immigrants here in San Diego. Our context is very different than the Good Samaritan story. It's very different, frankly, than some of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. We are in a context where, for example, when we talk about welcoming refugees, we're talking about welcoming some of the most carefully vetted individuals who've ever come into our country. And that's not just my opinion, that's the assessment of the Heritage Foundation and various other groups that have analyzed very carefully the vetting process for refugees. That refugee vetting process has also been incredibly effective. Since the Refugee Act was signed into law back in 1980, there's been about 3.5 million refugees resettled to the United States. And not a single one of them has has taken the life of an American citizen in an Islamist terrorist attack. Now, that's a really remarkable record. And I think a credit to our government. And our government doesn't do everything super well, but that's something I think they merit some credit for having a really effective process. Now, it also would be fair for you to say, okay, well, you just kind of cherry-picked the most thoroughly vetted immigrants to say how safe this is, but that's not the whole story. I mean, I was in Tijuana yesterday and crossed the border yesterday, and of course, there are people who've crossed the border unlawfully and weren't vetted at all. Isn't that a concern? And at World Relief, we would agree with you. That is a concern. We have always said we think that it actually is a responsibility of our government to ensure that we have secure borders. That is to say, our government should know who's coming into the country and should do everything reasonably possible to keep out anyone seeking to do harm. At the same time, it's actually not fair to presume that people who have come unlawfully, whether they crossed the border unlawfully or who overstayed a temporary visa or who had a legal protection that was then abruptly withdrawn, are disproportionately a threat to public safety. And I say that because most unauthorized immigrants who are not lawfully present have been here for a long time, on average more than 10 years, which is to say if their intention was to commit violent crimes, they've had adequate time to do so. And the vast majority of them have not. Of course, when one does, it's a headline story, and I'm very quick to affirm if somebody's gotten due process and is convicted for committing a violent crime, I want them to be detained and deported if they are ever allowed out of jail. But that's actually the exception to the rule, and we know that from a lot of data. Actually, the best data on this, in my opinion, comes out of the state of Texas, because it's the only state out of 50 that has consistently tracked the immigration legal status of felony convictions. And what we find in Texas, and I know you probably can't read the slides here, but we're happy to make this whole slide deck available. You can go read the study. I would encourage you to do so, is that consistently over time, and whether you're looking at different categories of crime, violent crime, property crime, drug crime, native-born Americans, U.S. citizens, which is my category, consistently are convicted of crimes at higher rates than immigrants, whether they're lawfully present or not. Now, I'm not on a per capita basis. I'm not telling you that so you'll be afraid of your U.S. citizen neighbors. Just to say that it's not particularly rational to be uniquely afraid of your immigrant neighbors, whether you think you know that they're lawfully present or not. I'm also not trying to make the argument that this is because immigrants are morally superior to U.S. citizens. I think what's probably most at play here is consequences. Because if you commit a crime as a U.S. citizen, you deal with the criminal justice system in your state. If you commit a crime as an immigrant, whether you have a green card legally here or not, you deal with the same criminal justice system, and then you get turned over to the federal immigration system, where even what might be a fairly minor criminal offense, something like stealing a candy bar in certain states, could be a deportable offense, even for an immigrant who's lawfully present with their green card, which is a good disincentive to committing crime, and that's a good thing. We don't want people committing crimes. Stealing candy bars are much worse. The flip side of this, so that can be very challenging, is while there's really good evidence that immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than U.S. citizens, there's also a lot of evidence that immigrants are victims of crime at higher rates. And that probably has to do with the same dynamic of not wanting to interact with law enforcement, even when someone is a victim, even when they're a witness to a crime, because they're concerned that speaking up might lend them to be asked about immigration legal questions and lead them to face deportation. One last thing in terms of kind of public safety and health, it would be around drugs. And I added this slide probably in the last year or two to my presentation because it didn't used to come up so often. Recently, it's a major dynamic we hear about. And obviously the fentanyl crisis in particular is something most of us are aware of in this country. I've been aware of it at least sort of peripherally for a while, but it became much more personal to me just a few years ago when my childhood best friend had an overdose. And thank God he's okay, and he's been sober for a number of years now. But I understood, probably in a new level, the instinct that people have to want to find someone to blame for this problem. And it makes sense to a lot of people when they hear that most fentanyl comes from or through Mexico to blame immigrants. But while it is actually true that most fentanyl comes from or through Mexico, it is not true that it is primarily carried by immigrants crossing the border illegally, or by immigrants at all. In fact, if you look at convictions for trafficking fentanyl, 80% or more of those convicted are U.S. citizens. And the vast majority of fentanyl is stopped not between the lawful ports of entry, but at the lawful ports of entry, like the San Isidro crossing that I crossed yesterday, and that frankly 100,000 people cross every day. And that's basically, it's a business decision from the cartels, which are evil, but also, it's not idiots. They know that if they put drugs on someone crossing the border who is most likely going to be caught, they're going to lose their product. But if a U.S. citizen who's crossing and is unlikely to be searched brings it in, it's not likely to be caught. And to be clear, I would like to stop people from unlawfully crossing over the border. But even if you could figure out how to do that, you would maybe solve a tiny fraction of the fentanyl trafficking. And as long as there's a market in the United States, it will find its way in somewhere else. I go through all that because I think sometimes we're so focused on the question of is this safe and maybe not looking very hard for the answer, that we forget to ask the question that was asked of Jesus, which is, who is my neighbor? And yes, the government has its role, and we can affirm that role, but the church also has its role, and that is to love, even if it's not completely safe, and most of the time it is. That, though, brings up one other theme that I think is important, which is, to bring up people who've crossed the border unlawfully or maybe who've overstayed a temporary visa. How do we think about that dynamic as Christians? Because on the one hand, we want to love and welcome and share the gospel with people, and on the other hand, we want to follow the law. And that's a good instinct. It comes from Scripture, in fact. Romans chapter 13 tells us that God has established government. That the government has been established by God, instituted by God, and there's this mandate for government to ensure order, security, to punish wrongdoers and protect those who are innocent. So, of course, this doesn't actually say very much to refugees who are lawfully resettled or other lawful immigrants, but how do we think about immigrants who are unlawfully present? Should we love and welcome them, or should we obey the law? Well, I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. We should love and welcome them, and we should, in almost every case, obey the law. I would say there could be circumstances, and we see this in Scripture, we see this at different points in history, where the law of a state is pretty explicitly against a divine commandment. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego worshiping idols, or the Hebrew midwives being told to kill little children, or the Magi, we talked about them in the Christmas story, not following instructions and going back and turning in the Christ child. Acts 5, we see Peter saying we must obey God rather than human beings. But I think that dynamic of civil disobedience really is reserved for a very clear instance where the law of God is contradicting the law of the state. And for those of us who are U.S. citizens, we're not very often in that situation when it comes to immigration. It's not actually a difficult question. Should you run an English class out of your church, or run a food pantry, or teach someone Sunday school, or let them teach Sunday school to you, which might be just as likely. As long as there's not compensation involved. That's where you get into a legal issue, is in terms of employment. But in terms of the normal ways that a church or a ministry or a citizen would interact with their neighbors, at least under case law that exists, you're not violating any laws. And we should be really cautious for changes to policy that would present religious liberty concerns, where you'd have the state telling the church, you're allowed to minister to these people, but you cannot minister to these people. Now, this is a harder issue for our brothers and sisters in Christ who are unauthorized in this country, who are undocumented. And I've interacted with a lot of those folks. I go to a Spanish-speaking church where this affects some of the people that I worship with most Sundays. What I would want you to know is that the vast majority of immigrants who don't have legal status are desperate to get right with the law, especially those who are believers, who have themselves read Romans 13. And in a few instances, that means going to our legal service team at World Relief and filling out some paperwork, and they can help you. But most of the time, they do not qualify for that legal status, even though they would be willing to do just about anything to obtain it. Usually they didn't qualify for legal status in the first place. A lot of the people that we're serving right now who are now undocumented actually were here lawfully. They went through the lawful process. People from countries like Venezuela and Cuba and Ukraine, Haiti, who came in very large numbers at the invitation of a U.S. sponsor, who went to the U.S. consulate in their country of origin, were vetted, flew on an airplane, arrived in this country, and just in the last few months have very abruptly been told that they are no longer lawfully present. They need to leave immediately. And leave immediately to countries that are, in each one of those cases, facing profound humanitarian crises. So what should they do? I'm not ready to give a one-size-fits-all prescription to how we respond to those circumstances, except for to say that what we have long said at World Relief, and many of our partners as well, is that there ought to be a way for someone who is outside of the law to make things right. We've never advocated an amnesty that says the law doesn't really matter, so we're going to hand out citizenship, but that there ought to be a way for people to come forward, pay a fine if you've violated the law, of course, undergo a criminal background check, and if you have committed serious, violent offenses, you'd be deported. But for the vast majority who have not, many of whom have been here for 20 or 30 years, actually, and have U.S. citizen children, there'd be the opportunity to make things right with that payment of a fine. That's not an innovative idea. That's actually the immigration policy that Barack Obama put forward in 2013 and that George Bush put forward in 2006. There's legislation in the Congress now that would propose precisely that sort of policy. And you pair that with making it harder to immigrate illegally, improvements to border security, but also making it easier to immigrate legally in the first place. Not without limit, but at least to meet the needs of the U.S. labor market, which even in a time when the economy is maybe a little bit shakier now than it was a year ago, we still see significant labor needs in particular parts of our labor market. A couple other points, and then we'll turn to Q&A. Some of us have heard this rhetoric. It's actually now like the official position of our government that the United States is facing an invasion in relation to immigration. But my view is actually immigration in the United States could be bringing about a revival. And that is because if you look at the countries that immigrants are coming from, many of them, if not most of them, are actually more Christian by many measures than the United States of America is at this point. Countries where people are more likely to be in church on a typical Sunday. And in fact, some of those immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, are fleeing their own country precisely because of their faith in Jesus. That is the dynamic that has led them to be persecuted. And when we welcome them, there's this sense in which we're welcoming Jesus himself. Because Jesus said in Matthew 25, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. And the disciples say, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or sick or in prison? And Jesus says, whatever you did for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it unto me. And whatever you did not do, you did not do unto me. If you look at refugee resettlement, for example, over the last couple decades, the top country of origin is Burma, also known as Myanmar, primarily a Buddhist country with a very repressive military regime. But the majority of refugees have been Christians. And then also a significant minority of Muslims, another persecuted religious group in Burma. A lot of those Christians are Baptists or Anglicans, and they can tell you about the American missionaries who brought the gospel to their people group 2 or 3 generations ago. And when we welcome them, we have this unique opportunity to stand with the persecuted church. And it's not just Burma, it's Christians from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Syria, from so many other parts of the world. That's true with asylum seekers as well. Real quickly, I'll tell you about my shoes. I wore these on purpose today. They're Air Jordans. That's pretty cool. And I know that it's pretty cool because usually my actual shoes that I wear most days are from Aldi. They were like the random stuff aisle. That's actually more my fashion style, $12 shoes from Aldi. But it was just about a year ago, I was at the Leuven conference in South Korea, and I got a text from my wife back in Chicagoland, and she said, Pastor Fernando just came by with Air Jordans for you. And I introduced that just as a way to tell you about Pastor Fernando, which he's given me permission to do. Fernando is from Mexico, from southern Mexico. He has this beautiful testimony of a lot of challenges in his life, some problems with alcohol addiction, and then someone shared the gospel with him, and it transformed his life, and he got clean from alcohol and became a pastor in time. With his wife, started a church, and actually had an inpatient drug and alcohol treatment program within their church. And it was thriving, and lots of people were finding Jesus and finding freedom from addiction. And then someone from one of the 2 kind of rival gangs that basically rules his town came and said, you've got somebody in your facility that you need to send out to us because they're part of the wrong group. And Pastor Fernando basically said, I don't have anything to do with gangs. I don't want anything to do with gangs. But if people come in and say they want Jesus and they want freedom from addiction, we're going to serve them. And we can't turn anyone away. Which is the right answer theologically, but the wrong answer for this gang because they killed this 14-year-old boy. And another young man who was with him. And they made clear to Pastor Fernando that he was going to be next. And he went to the police, and the police took some notes and said, we'll look into this. But a police officer pulled him aside and said, Pastor, you need to know that we're not going to do anything because we can't do anything. And you're on their list, and you really need to get out of here as quickly as you can. And eventually, he didn't actually go immediately because he really did not want to leave home and didn't know what to do with his wife and his daughters. But it became pretty clear that they were serious about it. Their church all but disbanded because it became kind of public information that there was this hit out on him, and nobody wants to go to a church where the pastor is likely to be harmed. And he made the very, very difficult decision to flee. Went up to the border, stayed in a church-based shelter, very similar to the one that I was in yesterday in Tijuana. This was in Ciudad Juarez, across from El Paso. And after a few days, under some policies that were in place under the previous administration, was allowed to cross over lawfully. He was allowed in by our government. And they asked him, well, where do you want your court date so we can decide if you get to stay here permanently or not to seek asylum? And he had a family at his church in Mexico who visited once a year, but they were now living as citizens or green card holders in Aurora, Illinois, where I live. And they're at my church. So he asked them, hey, could I stay with you? And they were willing to host him. So I met Pastor Fernando at Men's Bible Study. My pastor pulled me over and said, you really need to talk to this guy. I know you work with World Relief and you know about immigration laws. I don't know about immigration laws, but he needs to talk to someone. And we were able to connect him to an attorney and get him enrolled in English classes. And eventually his wife was able to come and pursue her own asylum claim. And he's still in that process. That was 2022 he arrived. His merits hearing for his asylum court date is in 2028, which is not that abnormal. On average, it takes about 4 to 5 years to get a final decision on an asylum hearing. And of course, his attorney will be making the argument that he faces a well-founded fear of persecution that is specifically tied to his religion and to his practice of his Christian faith. Whether a court's going to buy that or not, I certainly hope and pray that they do. I would ask you to hope to pray that they do. But winning an asylum claim can be very difficult, frankly, especially for Mexico. It's a pretty low rate of approval of asylum from Mexico. But I go through that because we have brothers and sisters who are directly at the center of a lot of these discussions. Again, looking at refugee resettlement last year, of 100,000 refugees resettled to the U.S., 29,000 were Christians from the 50 countries where Christians face the most severe persecution in the world. And that doesn't include other religious minorities who are also persecuted for their faith and who we think at World Relief also, because they're people made in the image of God, ought to have access to protection. Of course, the flip side to the reality that so many refugees and immigrants are Christians is others are not. Others are from other religious backgrounds, or maybe it's a nominal faith of some sort. And some Christians might see that as a threat, might see that as this could be a problem for our country. At World Relief, we've always viewed this as an incredible opportunity for the church, because you have people coming into the United States from every country in the world, many of whom will be encountering the story of the gospel for the first time in their lives, in a context of religious freedom, where we're free to share our faith, and they are free to receive it, which they weren't in many of their countries of origin. And they're also free to reject it, which we completely respect. We are big believers at World Relief in religious freedom. We don't want to impose faith on anyone or practice proselytism where you're kind of tricking someone into conversion. But proselytism is not the same as evangelism, which is an open invitation to a relationship with Jesus. And we've seen lots of people, when they're loved and welcomed well by a local church, ask that question of, why do you love us so much? And we get to, as 1 Peter says, to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is within you, and to do so with gentleness and respect. And we've seen lots of people make that decision, again, of their own will, not under any kind of coercion or pressure, to become followers of Jesus in this country. And we celebrate that. It's an opportunity that, frankly, gets turned off if we turn off refugee resettlement and largely turn off immigration. This quote from J.D. Payne, I think, is compelling. He says, "Something is missionally malignant whenever we're willing to make great sacrifices to travel the world to reach a people group, but are not willing to walk across the street." I'm going to close then with this quote from Ronald Reagan. I like this quote. He was your governor here in California, so it has a little resonance. This was actually President Reagan's farewell address to the nation in 1989. He said this: "I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. In my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, wind-swept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors. And the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here." Now, I've always kind of loved that rhetoric, in part because it roughly describes the sort of immigration policy that I would like to see. Yes, security, but also doors, opportunities for legal entry. But I also have to quibble just a little bit with President Reagan. And that is, he cites that phrase, a shining city upon a hill, to the Puritan colonist John Winthrop. And Winthrop did use that phrase to describe what would become part of the United States of America. But that's not the original source for that phrase. Those of you who know your Bibles know that these are the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Sisters and brothers, there are tens of millions of people around our world today who've been forced from their homes. A few of them have ended up here in San Diego County. A few more have ended up elsewhere in the United States. Most will never come to the United States. Not under this administration, but not under the last one either. That's just never been the reality. But many of them will be forming their opinions of Jesus based on the response of people who profess to follow him in this country and in Europe and in Latin America and in Africa and around the world. And whether that response is primarily characterized by love and by welcome and by advocacy, especially at a time when many immigrants feel under threat, or is characterized by apathy or even fear or hostility, that response is going to have a profound effect on how they think about the Jesus whom we profess to follow. And my prayer is that our response as the church in San Diego and in the United States and around the world would so reflect the love of God for people who are vulnerable that they would see our good deeds and would give glory to our Father who's in heaven. And with that, I think we have time for questions, 30, 35 minutes. I saved a good amount of time because there's a lot happening with immigration. I'm very happy to talk about immigration enforcement and detention or what's happened to the refugee program, but mostly I want to know what you all are wondering. So I think, Grant, you can tell us how to carry that out.
So what I'll do is I'll go around to anyone that raises your hands asking questions. If it's okay, I'll share one thing from a pastor's perspective.
Yeah.
I've been in San Diego 15 years ministering, and I've preached through most of the Pentateuch. I'm in Deuteronomy right now, but since I've worked here, I'm like, oh yeah, look what's there, and I've gone back to Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But right now I'm in Deuteronomy 14, and it's part of Moses preaching the third commandment, not to take God's name in vain. And guess what comes right at the end? I've read the Bible, but it sticks out to you later. A 3-year tithe every 3 years. Still take care of the ministers, but also the oppressed, the typical group, right? The hungry, the poor, the widows, and the orphans, but the other one is, as it always is, the stranger, the immigrant. And if we don't do that, God says we're taking his name in vain. So that's coming up soon, and I'm excited to see that. And I want to encourage, since I wear my pastor's hat too, the pastors who are here especially, I want to encourage you to bring those things out in the sermons and not overlook them, which is easy to do. There's pressure to do, but we need to give the whole counsel of God, and it's everywhere. It's amazing. That said, thanks for listening. We're going to open it up for questions and answers, and then at the end, Jane's going to come up to thank you and give a few closing remarks. So who's got questions? We've got to have some questions, I'm sure. Who's got a question or answer? I'll give you the mic. Yes.
Hi. You opened with a very startling but not surprising comment about 25% of evangelical Americans have a different view of immigrants and not based on the Bible. How do you suggest we engage? Sometimes they're just short conversations. You don't have long opportunities, but I'm sure you encounter that.
Yes. I appreciate that so much. First of all, I will give you some good news from that poll that I didn't put on a slide. The worst news is actually a very small share of evangelicals who think about this as a biblical issue. The good news is more than 3/4 of evangelical Christians actually already are on the same page on immigration policy when it comes to the sort of policies that World Relief supports. For example, a policy that would pair improvements to border security with an earned legalization process for immigrants who are unlawfully present in the country. 76% of evangelicals say they support that in that same poll. Now, I'd like that to be 100%, but you can't get 76% of evangelicals to agree on the Nicene Creed. So I feel like we're actually doing pretty well with that level of support. Now, I would say there is a very vocal minority that has a very strong counter perspective. My experience is what sometimes disarms that, not always, is first of all to listen. Usually there's something underneath the concerns that folks have. They've heard something about immigration, but for example, the concern around drugs, it's really right to be concerned about what drugs are doing to our society and to be concerned about the impact that those are having on human lives. Now, I think that it's misplaced to put the blame on that on immigrants because the data does not bear that out. And even if it did bear it out that some of those folks were immigrants, it wouldn't be fair to judge all other immigrants on account of what some small share had done. But I think to start with the affirmation of that concern, whether, I'm just using that as an example, but sometimes it's economics. People are struggling economically. They feel like, I'm not making it, and why should immigrants get help? Starting with that understanding of where people are coming from, and then especially with fellow believers, gently inviting people to go back to the scriptures. And I say go back to them. Sometimes, Grant just mentioned, sometimes most Christians have probably read, I don't know if it's fair to say most Christians have read the Bible. I'm sure plenty have not read the whole Bible, especially Deuteronomy and Leviticus and some of these passages that I'm referencing. But plenty have, and yet, I'm sympathetic to this because I grew up in a really wonderful church in Wisconsin that I'm very grateful for. But I was like the Sunday school all-star kid who kind of knew all the answers by the time I was 12 years old and had memorized a lot of Bible verses. But I don't think we ever memorized a Bible verse about how to treat immigrants. I find that that's not very common. Not because there are none of those verses. It's just maybe not the ones that we have focused in upon. And so gently saying, I just read this in Deuteronomy and it stood out to me in a new way. And I think we, of course, need to have secure borders and we want to stop people from bringing drugs in, but also we want to be compassionate. We want to keep families together. And how do we apply this biblical principle? And not everybody will go with you there, but I find more people will than sometimes we give them credit for. The other thing I think is really important to know right now, and I don't have a solution for this, but it's easy to think in our current moment, if I open up my phone and open up Instagram or Twitter, it is full of really scary stories of immigrants being torn apart from their families. And some of those stories I can't verify, but some of them are definitely true. But when my wife opens up her phone, she gets kitten videos. And I don't know how she gets those, but that would be so good for my mental health if I just had more kitten videos and fewer, really anxiety-producing stories of families being separated. And I have some relatives in rural Wisconsin who open up their phones, and they get pictures of immigrants who have murdered someone. It might be untrue, or it might be true in just one story that they repeat over and over and over again, but their understanding is that those people are being put away and protecting the rest of us. And actually, if that was the whole story, their response would be really rational. But the fact that I'm only getting part of the story and they're getting a very different part of the story, I'm not saying they're equal and opposite, because I actually think there are real sources for data and there is objective truth of how common is this. But to have a certain level of empathy that, especially in a society where we are all getting individualized algorithms deciding what we see so that we will buy, see more advertisements, we're not all starting at the same spot. And to have a little bit of do our best to take that into account before we just presume that if you're witnessing what I'm witnessing and you're happy about it, it's because you're a terrible person, or you're motivated by hatred or racism or whatever. That may be the case in some instances, but I think what's much more common is people just have very different information. And so being gentle and looking for the points of commonality, which for those of us who are believers is going to be the Bible.
As we know, the temperature right now is very divisive and hostile. So I guess I'm wondering, practically speaking, how can we still be serving and helping our immigrant neighbor in this current climate?
Yes. First of all, it makes it more important than ever. And part of that, if you have immigrant neighbors who you already are in relationship with, just staying in relationship with them, letting them know that you're there if something happens, that you care about them, checking in on them occasionally. I mentioned my friend Pastor Fernando. I got a text from him yesterday as I was presenting to a group with a story about more people being murdered in his town in Mexico, and just his anxiety that he might be sent back there. And I cannot solve that, but I can respond to it and give him a call and let him know I'm praying for him, and then not just saying I'm praying for you, but genuinely be praying for him, praying for the town that he comes from, and telling him the most important, accurate information for someone in his circumstance. So, for example, we aren't at World Relief advising anyone to break any laws, but we are helping people know what the rights are under the law, which is to say that if immigration enforcement comes to his apartment, which of course they know his address because he's been following this lawful process, he has to open the door if they have a warrant signed by a judge. And if they don't have a warrant signed by a judge, he's not legally obligated to open the door, just the way that I'm not obligated to open the door if some stranger comes to my door. Knowing that sort of information is helpful. Again, we're not telling anyone to break any laws, but to avail themselves to the legal protections that they do have under the law. And now, to be clear, you might say, well, he's here lawfully, so no one would come to his door. But actually, we're aware of quite a number of circumstances of people who have pending asylum claims, who entered lawfully, who are currently in detention. Which is really disturbing, and I'm not saying it's common, but it is happening, and that's incredibly concerning for, especially when you think about you might be in detention for years waiting for the final disposition of your case. Now, you can't be deported with a pending asylum claim, at least if the law is being followed, until the court makes a decision on your case, but they could detain you potentially. And there's a lot more resources for detaining immigrants today than there was 8 months ago. Last year, our budget for detention of immigrants at the federal level was $3.4 billion, which was enough to detain about 40,000 people a day. In the budget reconciliation bill that passed to the Congress and was signed by the president in July, the budget for immigrant detention is now $45 billion. And I just don't really know how to describe for you what a large number that is. Like, I don't know, my brain can't process $45 billion, but you can do the math on how many times more that is than what we previously had. And that's not the increase in funding for more ICE officers or more border security. All of that is in the bill as well, but specifically for detention. So I think being aware of those realities, letting people know what their rights are under the law, and just reminding them of your love and concern for them. And if you're thinking, well, I don't actually know those people, World Relief would love to help you volunteer and put you into relationship with immigrants in this community. I mean, that's the primary thing that we do, is help to facilitate those relationships from volunteers, teams from local churches, to walk alongside people in friendship. And it's an incredibly important need right now. Or if you're thinking, I would love to do that, but you don't understand how busy I am, we also could definitely use financial support right now. A lot of the funding that we previously had was governmental funding that has gone away in the last number of months, even as the needs are dramatically more. But we're really thankful. We have seen churches step up in just beautiful ways, and individuals step up in beautiful ways to help sustain our ability to partner with churches to care for refugees and other immigrants in this community and around the United States and really around the world. And that's an important way to be involved at this point as well, really more important than ever.
I'm going to take a question. If I could just add to that, I think of what you have shared with Ezekiel about this topic, standing in the gap. And I think what I'd like to suggest, as you mentioned, volunteering with World Relief, but there's a few representatives of other ministries here that I might try to highlight later, that my suggestion is get involved just personally with people and let people see you involved with them. Share on your social media, because I think that a lot of the time it's just a real personal story. They know you, they like you, so okay, maybe this is safe and okay. I think just the personalization of this, because there's such a depersonalization, and I think that's the standing in the gap. Get involved, make friends, and see what God does with it. I'm going to come to you. I think you're next. By the way, you can tell Matt's not a pastor because he nailed it on ending on time. So we've got time for questions and answers. Okay.
Given that the word advocacy is part of your title, what are the practical, meaningful roles that people in churches like we represent? Is there a role to play, and what would that look like in the realm of advocacy?
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. I mean, first of all, I want to just acknowledge that different churches have different political theologies. So, in one Christian tradition, it might be appropriate to talk about public policy in a way that others would say it's really not, or some might say, well, that's appropriate for a special event on a Sunday evening, but not for Sunday morning from the pulpit. And we really respect that. Like, people are going to approach these things from different angles. I would say, I guess it depends what we mean by advocacy. Sometimes we hear advocacy and we think persuading the government to do something, and that is actually definitely a part of government, or a part of advocacy. I think there's biblical models of advocacy in that. You have people like Moses and Esther and Elijah and John the Baptist confronting governmental leaders in moments of injustice. And sometimes it goes really well for them, like Esther and Moses, and sometimes it doesn't go very well, though I don't think any of you are going to get your head chopped off like John the Baptist. That's sort of my view of advocacy, is there's a place for government relations, but I also think that to step back, there's a role of advocating for immigrants within the church. which can be as simple as reminding people of this command to love your neighbors, and that specifically includes immigrants. And you may or may not ever mention public policy, but if I'm in a church where that's political to say you should love immigrants, well, that's just reading Deuteronomy 10. And if the fear of being political means we have to skip certain chapters of the Bible, I don't think we're being faithful to Scripture. Now, if you want to get to the point of government relations, it's incredibly helpful when pastors in particular, who have sort of a community leader role, but others as well, meet with their members of Congress or their staff. Basically, you don't have to be a public policy expert. In World Relief, we have public policy experts who would be happy to help sort of accompany you into that process. But what's really powerful for a congressional office is to hear stories as localized as possible from their state, for a senator, from their congressional district. And some of your members of Congress probably don't need to be persuaded, and then it's good to say thank you occasionally, because they don't actually hear thank you very often. Just like pastors, members of Congress don't get thank yous very often. They only hear when people are upset with them. Some of you might have a member of Congress who actually very much needs to be persuaded. And meeting with some pastors, some community leaders could be very helpful, from immigrants who are themselves affected, if that's safe for them. I would also say, I think it's easy, obviously meeting with them is one thing to do. Those phone calls that you always hear people saying, like, call your member of Congress, I know that there's a certain sense of like, that doesn't make any difference. And it doesn't make a difference if one person does it. But when lots of people are doing it, it really does make a difference. I mean, I spend a lot of my time in Washington, D.C. I'd much rather spend my time in San Diego, but it's my job, so I'm in D.C. quite a bit. And I've been on Capitol Hill, actually the time that stands out for me, in 2018, June of 2018, the first Trump administration had put into place this zero tolerance policy at the border, which effectively meant that there was small children being separated from their mothers and fathers at the border. And that policy, it turns out, it took months before people really paid attention to it. But once there was a wide public awareness of it, it was not a popular policy. Polling at the time showed that most evangelical Christians were against it, most Catholics were against it, most secular people were against it, most Republicans were against it, most Democrats were against it. And I was on Capitol Hill, and I think it was June 18th, 2018. Every office I was in, the nice, usually college student intern at the desk, in the front desk, was answering the phone, like ringing off the hook. And I only heard one side of the conversation, but it would be something like, oh no, my boss is definitely against tearing children from their mothers. No, I'm actually against, my boss is against separating families. And this was not even a congressional policy. Like, Congress had not passed some new law that put this into effect. It was the administration having a new interpretation of the law that was having this effect. But clearly, especially on one side of the aisle, they were calling down the White House and saying, hey, we're coming up on midterm elections, and you're actually hurting us here. This is not going to play well in the midterms. And 2 days later, the president signed an executive order undoing that policy, which didn't completely undo it, but mostly undid it. And I mean, we've seen examples even in the last few months on a separate policy issue that's very important to us at World Relief, outside of immigration, but we do a lot of work with people who have HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. And we were really involved in advocating for the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief back when that was George W. Bush's policy in 2003. And that program, which has been very bipartisan, has saved an estimated 26 million lives, which is why, as people who believe in the dignity of human life, we think it's a really good program. The administration proposed pulling back $400 million from that program. And we got lots of people to call their members of Congress and call their senators, and we had some people who knew Senator Collins in Maine, who's the chair of the Budget Committee. And there was enough Republicans and Democrats working together to stop those funds from being rescinded just a couple months ago. So it still can actually make a difference when people are politely, respectfully engaging with their government officials. And the sort of cumulative idea that this doesn't make any difference is why it usually doesn't make any difference.
I hope this question doesn't come across as paranoid. You shared the story of your pastor friend, Fernando, I believe, and Grant was talking about humanizing it. I have been hesitant to share stories for the fear of drawing undue attention to people, and I'm curious if you could comment on that. Are we putting people at risk?
Yes, it's not a paranoid question. It's a really good question, and it's hard to know how paranoid it is, but that is to say it might not be paranoid. And that's why I mentioned that, like, Pastor Fernando has explicitly told me he wants me to share his story, because I would actually encourage you not to share people's story without their permission, even with really good intentions. But I would have the conversation with someone And maybe it's a conversation like, I didn't tell you Pastor Fernando's last name, because you don't need to know that for you to be moved by his story. But I also asked him that, like, what do you want me to share and what do you not want me to share? And someone might tell you, well, you could share my story, but please just don't share my name, or anything that would make it obvious to anyone who's listening where I live, or who, so many details, like Juan, who works at the Starbucks on 34th Street or whatever, like maybe you didn't share his real name, but you kind of sent people right to him. But I have a friend, and, if vague enough, again, even that, I would want you to have someone's permission. But I think people should have the ability to kind of control how their own stories are used wherever possible. And we are in a moment where I hope our government wouldn't sort of penalize people for using their voices, but I can't be confident of that. But it is, when people are willing to share their stories, it makes a huge difference. And that's the tension, I think. Because it's a few isolated stories of immigrants committing terrible crimes, which could be true stories, and I have a lot of empathy for, and I want those immigrants who committed terrible crimes imprisoned if, and then detained and deported if appropriate. But when those are the only stories that people hear, it's part of what is shaping narratives to make some of these policies possible.
Thank you very much, Matt, for your presentation today. Appreciate it. So we have a lot of individuals that want to do a lot of good things, right? But how can we make the foreigner, the orphan, how can we make them feel that they are welcome to come to a church and ask questions? How can the church, the community, reach them so they feel, look, I feel safe enough here to come at least knock on the door?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's a great question, a common question, and one that there's not like a silver bullet answer to. Because some immigrants are going to come from a background where they're going to knock on your door because you're Presbyterians and they're Presbyterians and they're exactly who they were looking for, or Baptists or Anglicans or whatever, or Nazarenes. And others, their stereotype of Christians is actually something very negative, and they're unlikely to come to the door unless there's a relationship built that starts to change that perspective. I would say one thing that does matter, I was just with a pastor a couple days ago who was sharing kind of the heartbreak he had as an immigrant in his former church, where they were not saying things to indicate how welcome immigrants were, but actually saying things that implied that immigrants were not welcome. And maybe they didn't know, even though he was a part of their church and had been a long time, the whole part of his story. But, preaching on what the scriptures say about immigrants is one way to help people it's a way to affirm that we share these biblical convictions around immigrants. And I think that goes a ways. Being culturally both competent and sensitive is another way. Sometimes when you are trying to be a church that represents people of different cultural backgrounds, it means everyone's going to be uncomfortable sometimes. And if the expectation is, well, we're the majority here, so we'll never be uncomfortable and they can all accommodate to us, that's frankly kind of the standard model, and it doesn't work very well for drawing people in. But I think, that's something I think our World Relief office would also love to talk with you, and how can we help you to think through what steps can we take as a church to be more welcoming, to communicate that we're standing with immigrants who are in vulnerable positions right now.
Great questions, so we can keep answering more later. We do want to keep on time, partly because he needs to catch a plane in a little while. I don't want to get in trouble with your wife. So Jane's going to come up in a moment. I did want to just share, when I mentioned standing in the gap, not necessarily pictures on social media, depending on the situation, but people hearing about having relationships and you sharing those stories that are real stories. And could I just have Crystal and Douglas and David, and I think I'm missing someone. Oh, Donna Maria, would you mind standing up really quickly? I just want to introduce, these are all folks leading ministries or in different ways serving that. I'd encourage you to talk to them too. There might be some ways, as well as World Relief, to have those opportunities to stand in the gap with relations. I'll let them share their stories. Do you want to use this mic or this mic?
Sure.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. First of all, I just want to thank you guys for being here. It's a very important topic, timely. Also, I know this is a really interesting time to be a pastor. It's a really interesting time to be a Christian. But I actually really believe it's a critical time. I really believe there's a huge opportunity for us to be Christ-like and to really represent Jesus in this moment. So I want to encourage you guys to really prayerfully ask God, what are you asking me to do? What can I do personally? What can my church do? What can my community do? And how can we be the aroma of Christ at such an important moment in our country? Don't underestimate the impact that you can make yourself. I feel like it's actually a huge opportunity for God to use us individually. Even in my own family's story, my mom actually came on a nursing visa by herself when she was 19. And she actually was welcomed by an older Christian woman in Alabama at a time where it was white or black, and she was neither, and they didn't know what to do with her. But this woman had never gotten married, never had kids, took my mom in, and really showed Christ to her. My mom's family, both sides, were deeply, deeply Buddhist. And because of this one woman and her love and welcome, my whole family follows Jesus now. And I'm here today really because of this one woman's impact. I never even knew her name, actually, but this one woman's hospitality, that was the aroma of Christ for our family. So don't underestimate what you yourself can do, okay? World Relief has really been impacted by a lot of things. A lot of changes, a lot of shifts, as federal programs have pulled back. I actually really believe it's a huge opportunity for the church, for followers of Jesus, to be his tangible hands and feet, and for us to really step in the gap and really bring back and revive mercy ministries in our church, and for our churches to actually really be a city on a hill. So would you guys prayerfully just consider that and ask the Lord, just even as I'm sharing, what do you want us to do? And asking, what are the loaves and the fishes that you've put in our hands for this moment? And what has God given you that he wants to use for the sake of others? So we have a number of opportunities. I don't know if you can change the slide. Okay. So as you prayerfully consider what God's calling you to do, calling your church to do, would you consider giving? Right now, really, with the loss of federal funding, every cent counts. We've had a donor that's given $10 a month for years. And for her, this is what she can do, but this is what she's faithfully done for years. So don't underestimate how God can use that little bit that you can set aside. Would you guys consider serving? Volunteering either yourself, volunteering with your church or your small group. We have a number of opportunities. We have Cafe English is an English program that we've actually started in the community in City Heights. That happens 2 days a week. And then we have Cafe English also in San Marcos. And so those are incredible opportunities to just tangibly meet with people that are really working on improving their English so they can get into the workforce, so they can be self-sufficient, and they can care for their families. We're also looking for good neighbor teams. So that's small groups that are coming around a family and committing to walking alongside one family for 6 months to a year as they navigate, a whole new culture and country. Would you also consider being an ambassador? So part of being an ambassador is actually representing World Relief in the community, tabling for us, actually sharing, and running things like welcoming the stranger Bible studies and book studies. We also encourage you to learn. We have something called The Workshop. It's our e-learning platform. And we've got Welcoming the Stranger Bible Studies. You can learn about different people groups that are arriving. Ukrainians, Haitians, Congolese, an array of different culture-specific trainings. And then trainings about what does a refugee journey look like? What does an asylum seeker journey look like? Because we recognize there's like a huge knowledge gap that can exist with such a complicated topic. And then preaching, we actually have some sermon resources. I really believe that God has given pastors such a unique call and such an important platform today. And I know for many pastors, they're expected to be subject matter experts. It's very difficult to be a subject matter expert on such a complicated, constantly changing topic. But I know that your congregations, your members from your churches are coming to you and asking you questions that are like, you don't even know where to begin. So you can check out our preaching resources. We have sermon outlines and even ways for you to uniquely kind of interweave just the nations and stories from around the world into your messages. So we are here for you, and we're ready to walk alongside you as you ask God, how do I even bring this up in my church, or how do I bring this up with elders or deacons? We have a number of resources in the back that you're welcome to check out. A lot of books actually that Matt wrote as well and co-authored. But I also encourage you just to befriend an immigrant, or for pastors to really befriend an immigrant pastor and ask them about their journey, and see how you can pray for them and see how they can pray for you, and build proximity into your own life and break bread together. So before I pray, I actually wanted to take a moment and I wanted to honor Grant, because Grant actually is transitioning into chaplaincy. So he actually got accepted into a chaplaincy program that is starting very soon. I want to say it's next week. A week from today. So if you can just join me and thank him for his time with World Relief. And then in the interim, for volunteers and pastors that are interested in connecting locally, you can connect with myself or with Seto. Seto is our community engagement manager, and she's working with volunteers, good neighbor teams, and tabling events and representing us in the community. And also, we also have a event November 3rd, actually at Fuller Seminary, that we're doing in collaboration with them. We're having Mark Laberton, the former president of Fuller, Alexia Salvatierra, who's the dean at Fuller Central Latino, Mike McClenahan, who was the former pastor at Solana Beach Pres, Pastor Ara Tarosian, he's an Iranian pastor in LA, who came himself as a refugee. And several of his church members, actually, who were here legally present, were arrested unlawfully and detained, and so he'll also be sharing. And then Daniel Yang, our director of Churches of Welcome, will be moderating that panel. So we'd love to have you there. It's going to be a really informative conversation, and the hope is to really equip pastors and Christians to really learn how to lean into this even more. So let me just pray for us, and then Matt's going to be available. Our staff will be available for any questions afterwards, okay? Jesus, thank you so much for this time together, for rich conversation, and just all these people that have come to lean in and that want to know your heart on this tricky topic. And God, we're just reminded that you are the God who loves and protects the foreigner and the widow and the orphan. And we're reminded also that we are ones who were welcomed and loved when we were once foreigners. So Jesus, from that place, would you bring to mind just really clearly how you're leading us to really guide and lead our congregations faithfully to bear Christ-like witness at such an important moment. Lord, would you show us how to do that? Would you have your way in us? Would you use us? Would you use our churches? And would it just be evident that you are here in our midst and using the church to really spread, to be your hands and feet and spread your aroma? In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, guys.